The life of Suleiman the Magnificent, the peak of Ottoman power. In the dust of forgotten centuries, where empires rise like thunder and vanish like smoke, there was one name that echoed across 3 continents, not whispered in fear alone, but spoken in awe. He was born into a world already carved by conquest, yet destined to carve it deeper. A boy who would not just inherit a throne, but reshape the meaning of empire itself. From the golden halls of Istanbul to the burning frontiers of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, his shadow stretched further than any crown had dared before. Armies bowed to his banners, kings measured their fear in his advance, and history itself seemed to pause whenever his name was spoken. This is not just the story of a ruler. This is the rise of a mind that turned law into order, war into strategy, and power into legend. Because in the 16th century, at the very peak of Ottoman greatness, there was one man the world would come to know as Suleiman the Magnificent. Let's start Yusufzade dynasty history. Suleiman the Magnificent did not inherit a weak empire, he inherited a giant already in motion, an empire that stretched from the gates of Europe to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of Persia to the shores of North Africa. But what he saw was not completion, he saw unfinished destiny. When he took the throne in 1520, the world held its breath without realizing it. He was young, only 25, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he ruled. He did not rush into chaos, he did not act like a conqueror drunk on early power. Instead, he moved with a calm precision that made even his enemies uneasy. Because Suleiman understood something that many rulers never grasped: empires do not fall from weakness alone, they fall from disorder. And so, before the world felt the full weight of his armies, Suleiman strengthened the foundation beneath them. He restructured laws across the empire, ensuring that justice did not bend differently in distant provinces. What he created was not just authority, it was consistency across continents. A farmer in the Balkans and a merchant in Damascus were now bound by the same legal order. This earned him a name that would outlive fear itself, the lawgiver. But laws alone do not define empires. In the eyes of history, expansion does. And Suleiman was watching Europe. In 1521, he struck Belgrade. It was not just a fortress, it was a key, the gate to Central Europe. When it fell, it was not a slow decline, it was a rupture. The walls that had stood as a symbol of resistance collapsed under Ottoman siege, and Europe realized something uncomfortable: the Ottoman Empire was no longer at its edge, it was pushing inward. The following year, Rhodes fell, a stronghold of knights, warriors trained for generations in siege warfare, believed themselves untouchable, yet Suleiman's forces surrounded them, cut them off, and slowly erased their resistance. After months of relentless pressure, the island surrendered. Even in victory, Suleiman allowed the defeated to leave alive. It was not mercy born of weakness, it was strategy. Reputation was a weapon, and he understood how to wield it. By now, Europe was no longer dismissing the Ottomans as a distant Eastern power, they were studying them, fearing them. Then came Mohacs in 1526. It was not a long battle, it did not need to be. The Hungarian army stood against the Ottomans in open field, believing numbers and courage would hold, but within hours, their formation collapsed, their king died, their resistance dissolved into chaos. A kingdom that had stood for centuries was shattered in a single afternoon. After Mohacs, the road to Central Europe lay open, and Suleiman marched forward, stopping only at Vienna's gates. The siege of Vienna in 1529 was not a simple failure or success, it was a statement. Even though the city did not fall, its walls were tested by an empire that had already proven it could destroy kingdoms in days. The message was clear: Vienna was not safe, Europe was not beyond reach. But Suleiman's vision did not stop at land. The seas were next. At the same time his armies pushed across Europe, his naval power was rising under commanders who would become legends in their own right. The Mediterranean was no longer a divided space of competing coastal powers, it was becoming an Ottoman corridor. Venice, Spain, and the Holy League once believed the sea belonged to them, but under Suleiman's rule, that belief began to fracture. In 1538, at Preveza, the Ottoman fleet crushed a coalition of European navies. It was not just a battle of ships, it was a collapse of confidence. The Mediterranean, once a contested ocean, now moved under Ottoman dominance. Trade routes shifted, naval power balances broke, and Suleiman's empire reached into every wave that touched 3 continents. But Suleiman was not satisfied with dominance in one direction, he expanded everywhere at once. To the east, he clashed with the Safavid Empire. These wars were not quick victories, they were long, brutal struggles across mountains and deserts where control shifted repeatedly. But Suleiman's goal was not just land, it was control of the arteries that connected Asia to the Middle East. Each campaign carved deeper into the structure of regional power. To the south, Ottoman authority extended into the heart of Arabia. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina came under imperial protection. This was not just territorial expansion, it was spiritual legitimacy. The empire was no longer just a political force, it was becoming a guardian of faith. And while armies marched and navies expanded, Istanbul transformed. The city became something more than a capital, it became a symbol of civilization under imperial design. Massive architectural projects reshaped the skyline, domes rose that seemed to challenge the sky itself, bridges connected neighborhoods like veins of a living organism, markets, schools, mosques, all built with intention, not randomness. At the center of this transformation stood architects and thinkers who worked under Suleiman's vision. The city no longer simply housed an empire, it reflected it. And yet, behind all this grandeur, Suleiman was not distant from culture, he was part of it. He wrote poetry not as a hobby, but as expression. Under the name Muhibbi, he composed verses that revealed a different side of him, one not of conquest, but of reflection. In those lines, he was not a ruler, he was a man aware of time, mortality, and the weight of existence. Because even the most powerful empires cannot silence the awareness that everything built will one day be tested. As his empire expanded, so did its complexity. Managing territories across continents was not just a matter of armies, it required systems, administrators, loyalty structures, and constant vigilance. Suleiman's brilliance was not only in expansion, but in maintaining coherence across chaos. But no system is immune to tension. Within the imperial court, rivalries began to surface. Succession, always a sensitive matter in dynastic rule, grew increasingly dangerous. Family bonds became intertwined with political survival. Alliances formed and broke in silence behind palace walls. Even Suleiman, with all his authority, could not fully control what succession would bring after him. Still, during his reign, the empire reached a level of influence that few civilizations in history have matched. Its borders stretched across continents, its navy controlled seas, its laws structured societies, its culture influenced art, architecture, and governance. But greatness always carries its own pressure. The larger the empire, the harder it becomes to hold it together. The more distant the borders, the harder it becomes to keep them aligned. The more powerful the center, the heavier the responsibility it bears. Suleiman understood this balance better than most. He was not blind to the fragility beneath strength. He knew that empires are not just built through victories, but maintained through constant effort. And yet, he pushed forward anyway. Because for Suleiman, power was not an endpoint, it was a responsibility. By the time he reached the later years of his reign, the Ottoman Empire was no longer rising, it had risen. It stood at its peak, militarily unmatched, culturally rich, administratively refined, and territorially vast. From the outside, it looked unshakable. But from within, it was a living structure that required constant energy to sustain. And Suleiman was the force holding it in balance. Not just as a conqueror. Not just as a lawmaker. But as the final embodiment of an empire at its greatest height. The world around him changed constantly, new alliances, new wars, new threats, but the name Suleiman remained a constant echo through every battlefield, every treaty, every court. Because during his reign, the Ottoman Empire was not simply powerful. It was at its absolute peak. And at the center of that peak stood a man who turned ambition into system, war into order, and rule into legacy. A man whose life did not just belong to history, but defined one of its greatest ages. And so, the story of Suleiman the Magnificent does not fade the way ordinary stories do. It lingers. Like the echo of marching armies across ancient plains, like the silence after cannons stop shaking the walls of empires. Because Suleiman was never just a ruler who held power for a moment in time, he was the man who defined what power looked like at its peak. When he died in 1566, far from the marble halls of Istanbul, on a campaign that stretched his empire one last time toward Europe, it did not feel like the end of a reign. It felt like the closing of an entire era. A breath held for decades, finally released. The empire he shaped did not disappear, it continued, it expanded further in some directions, fractured in others, but never again would it feel quite the same, because Suleiman was not just part of Ottoman history. He was its highest point. The moment when law, war, culture, faith, and ambition all aligned under one vision, when the Ottoman Empire was not just large, but fully realized, not just feared, but respected, not just expanding, but defining the world around it. And history, as it often does, moved forward. But it never moved away from him. Because every empire has its peak. And every peak has a name. Suleiman the Magnificent. The Lawgiver. The shadow that stretched from Europe to Asia, and left behind a legacy carved into stone, law, and memory itself. And now the question remains. When an empire reaches its greatest height, does it stand as a symbol of strength? Or a reminder that even greatness cannot last forever? The answer, like Suleiman's legacy, is written across centuries. Quiet, unshakable, eternal. If you made it this far, you're not just watching history, you're living it. So don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another untold story from the past. Because here on Dynasty History, we don't just tell history. We bring empires back to life.